Let's get into a spoiler-free movie review now. If you're watching on YouTube, you will see that I am decked out in all my Nike gear because we're talking about Air today, and the movie is about the creation of the Air Jordan shoe. So I actually have a partnership with Nike. I don't think I've shared this on the show before, but I have this really cool deal worked out where all I have to do is go on Nike's website, pick out anything that I want, pay for it with my own money, and they send it to me. So I have this great deal. That is why I'm decked out in my Nike gear today to talk about Air. And I'll have to say, at the top of this review, that is what I was worried about going into this movie, because based off of the trailer, it almost felt like it was going to be a 2-hour long Nike commercial. And I was worried about that. You know, whenever the Facebook movie came out back in the 2010s, The Social Network, I feel like I had that similar feeling of like, am I really going to go watch a Facebook movie? Is it going to be that compelling? And I was proved wrong there, and I was proved wrong guess again, because this movie did not feel like a 2-hour long Nike commercial. So we'll get into all the details about this movie. So many great things involved in this movie, from the real life story involved with Nike and Michael Jordan, but also how this movie saw the light of day. How this movie was written and then ended up on the big screen is one of my favorite parts of the entire story. So before we get into all that, here is just a little bit of the Air trailer.
You asked me what I do here. This is what I do. I find you players, and I feel it this time. Yeah, okay, it's risky. When you were selling sneakers out of the back of your Plymouth, that was risky. Don't change that now.
For a rookie?
Yes.
Who's never set foot on an NBA court.
That's the literal definition of rookie, yeah.
What's the plan?
We build a shoe line around just him. I need the greatest basketball shoe that's ever been made.
Who's the player?
Michael Jordan.
So this movie is not the story of Michael Jordan. It is the story of the creation of the Air Jordan shoe, so much so that you don't even really see Michael Jordan in this movie, mainly from the back. There's some brief little glimpses of Michael Jordan, but they didn't want to focus on his story. Director Ben Affleck actually said that's a different story to tell. Instead, the movie focuses on Sonny Vaccaro, played by Matt Damon, and he is a sports marketing executive in the 80s at Nike. And this is a time where Nike wasn't at the top, at least in the basketball world. They were crushing it in their running shoe sales, but when it came to their basketball department, it was struggling. They weren't selling many shoes, and they were really being beat out by their competitors, Converse and Adidas, who were signing all the big athletes, had the big rosters, had all the money to throw around. So it was going to be a natural fit for Michael Jordan to go to either Adidas or Converse. So he really wasn't even in their plans to go after. They wanted to sign 3 players, but instead Sonny Vaccaro became obsessed with Michael Jordan, was watching all of his tape from his college days in North Carolina, and he thought that Nike should, instead of going after those 3 players, put all of the money from their budget into just landing Michael Jordan and creating an entire shoe line around him, which hadn't been done before. So instead of getting 3 players that are just not going to really do much for the company, let's go after one and put all of our eggs in one basket, because he was so passionate about him and was so just enthralled by everything Michael Jordan was doing as a player that he knew in his gut that this was the best decision to make for Nike. One of the most powerful things in this movie is seeing how Nike wasn't dominating at this point, and you root for Nike, which is weird to root for a corporation to sign somebody to make more money. But in this situation, it had me wanting Nike to win. They felt like the underdog in this movie. So I think that's why this movie really worked, to be able to depict such a large corporation to be the underdog. And we as Americans, we as people just love rooting for an underdog story. So that was actually pretty powerful. So I'll give that to Ben Affleck's filmmaking style, to really making us root for Nike in this situation, and also not really making it feel like a 2-hour long Nike commercial. Now, you do see a lot of Nike throughout, and I'll admit, after I watched this movie, I started Googling things like, ooh, I kind of like those old school classic running shoes. I got to find me some of those. And also, when it comes to actual Air Jordans, I didn't have any money growing up, so I've never owned a pair of Air Jordans. But after this movie, I was looking at those retro ones to try and get a pair of the shoes featured in this movie because they are so cool. So maybe a little bit it did work as a commercial, but it didn't feel like they were just throwing it down your throat. And also, it doesn't really depict Nike as this grand organization that has no flaws. It shows some of their flaws. It talks about some of their practices of how their shoes are made, all of the struggles they're going through. So it doesn't really feel like Nike was behind this and saying like, oh, you can't make us look bad at all. I felt like it went through the highs and the lows of the company to give a real life picture of what was actually going on back in the 80s. And from the very opening scene of this movie, it felt like an 80s time capsule. The 80s seemed like a wild time to be alive. I really love the cinematography and the opening shot of this movie. The real grainy footage, all the contrasting colors of the 80s, it really made it feel like a little time capsule. And I love the shift in that opening scene where it goes from that grainy 80s look to a more modern appeal, but still kind of keeping that aesthetic. And there was a lot of attention to detail in this movie. Everything from when Matt Damon's character would go into a 7-Eleven, all the products on the shelf looked like 80s products, all the cars, all the fashion, very much felt like the 80s. So they did a really good job of putting us in that mindset and believing that this movie was made back in the day. That combined with the 80s soundtrack made me feel nostalgic for the 80s. I grew up in the 90s, but after watching this movie, I thought maybe I was born in the wrong decade. And that also helped with another aspect of the movie, because a lot of this movie takes place over phone calls. And it made me realize that you couldn't really make a movie with a story like this past 2007. Once the iPhone was created, nobody had phone conversations like they do in this movie. A lot of slamming of phones, a lot of dialing of phones, and a lot of the dialogue that took place was just phone conversations. And that wouldn't really work today. It really made me feel nostalgic for being able to slam a phone call after a heated conversation. So in an iPhone era world, in a smartphone world, we won't really have that anymore. So we have to find more stories like this that took place before 2007 to have that gratification of somebody slamming a phone. Because now, if this story takes place, say you focused on the LeBron James story, all that is email, text messages, DMs. It's not really going to feel the same way. There were so many standout performances in this movie, from Chris Tucker in the opening scene. Very rarely do you get such a powerful opening from a supporting cast member, but it really made me appreciate Chris Tucker, and he has been so funny throughout his entire career in all of his roles from Friday that sometimes I wonder, like, why doesn't he go back and do a Friday movie? This movie was an example of why he should never do that, because he is worth more than that, and he can do a higher caliber movie like this and be great in it. There was so much great dialogue throughout this entire movie. That's what really carried it, because this movie is just really straight on filmmaking. There are no bells and whistles. It all comes down to the dialogue and the script. And what blew me away about the making of Air is that this entire movie exists because this dude who was unemployed in his 20s watched The Last Dance. This 20-year-old named Alex was just watching The Last Dance. And there's a part in that documentary where they briefly mention the partnership between Michael Jordan and Nike. And Alex saw that and thought, that deserves to be a movie. Somebody has probably already made that movie, right? Googled it up. No one has made it. So we sat down and wrote this script and just sent it out as a spec script. And that is how this movie was made. And Alex is a master of dialogue, because this movie was more comedic than actual comedies. It's one of the funniest movies I've seen in the last 2 years. And it's not even trying to be funny. All of the dialogue is just written so well that the entire theater was laughing throughout this entire movie. And the dialogue felt so natural between Ben Affleck and Matt Damon. You think, they must have wrote it? No, it's all thanks to Alex. So this movie is filmmaking, screenwriting at its best. I thought maybe the absence of Michael Jordan would make it a little less exciting, but they proved me wrong. It really doesn't need him at all. And this movie was really inspiring to me because of Sonny Vaccaro's story. It really shows you by the end of the movie that all you have to do is be passionate and put a lot of time and effort to those things you are passionate about, because that is what he did. When all the big companies were going after Michael Jordan, they were only telling him and boasting all of the things that made their companies great, not what made him great. And Sonny Vaccaro was the only one that pointed out all of the things that made Michael Jordan great and why he would go on to be a global superstar. So it really proved to me that you need to find somebody who believes in you, somebody who really knows you. Invest in the people who invest in you. And also, when making any kind of deal, whether in a job interview, a deal with your significant other, always ask the right questions. That is what this movie is all about. Ask the right questions in those situations that are going to benefit you in the long run. I'll quote one of my favorite 80s movies, Stand and Deliver. Sometimes you only see the turn. You don't see the road ahead. Because MJ and his mom, they were not just trying to make a lot of money with him signing with a random company. They were looking out for his entire life, and they knew he was something different, and they knew he needed to get paid for that. The other really impressive thing is that Ben Affleck has only made 5 movies in his career. I'm really enjoying the veteran actor turned director because I think they have this vision that only somebody who has done this for so long at such a high level and knows what it's like to be an actor on screen and also knows what it's like to get the performances that you need to make a movie great. And he has proved that in just 5 films. This is definitely my favorite Ben Affleck directed film. I'd go Air, The Town from 2010 at 2, and then Argo from 2012 at number 3. Because it is pretty impressive to make a movie about the origin of a shoe be this entertaining. And even more impressive that you could have us rooting for Nike and then leave the theater wanting to go buy our own Air Jordans. So this movie is definitely a must-see, and we're really not getting a high level of sports drama anymore. So this one is already easily entered for me into the top 10 sports dramas of all time. In the last 5 years, easily top 3, probably the number 1. If you love movies like Moneyball, this is definitely right up your alley, and you don't even have to like sports to enjoy this movie. So if I had to rate Air, it is almost a perfect movie, and the only reason I deducted a half a point is because with a movie based on a true story like this, I would want it to be as accurate as possible. And I know you have to embellish some details to Hollywood up a story and really give it that driving factor that's going to make you leave the theater and be inspired. So I was that. I was 5 out of 5 leaving the theater. After doing some research on the story, this is where my mind changed a little bit. And I don't want to spoil it. Even though it is a true story, I feel like you can still spoil it. There are some details in the story that Michael Jordan said aren't completely true, and he oversaw a lot of the filmmaking process early on in this movie to kind of sign off on it. And what he said kind of changes your perspective on a big aspect of this movie. That's all I'm going to say. But it's a pretty big aspect. So at just the entertainment value, this is as good as it gets with the sports drama. It would be a 5 out of 5. But because of that, I can't let go what he said. So my rating for Air would be 4.5 out of 5 Air Jordans.